The first thing I noticed was that the aquarium was still running. It sat behind the reception desk of a pediatric dentist's office on the east side of town, glowing a dim, artificial blue through the dusty front glass, with 3 pale fish moving slowly, as if the world outside had not changed enough to matter. The waiting room chairs were still in their semicircle. A bead maze stood tipped on its side near the children's books. The little prize machine by the counter still held plastic rings and rubber spiders, though the clear dome had filmed over with dust. The door was locked. The building looked empty. The aquarium pump was humming. I stood on the sidewalk with my satchel against one hip and my chalk pencil in my hand and listened for a full minute before I did anything else. That was rule 1. Not because fish are dangerous, because small systems outlast people in ways that can mislead you. A running fan, a light on a timer, a refrigerator compressor, an aquarium filter, a wind toy turning in a window. None of those things prove a building is safe or occupied. They only prove that time has not finished with it yet. The street around me was quiet in the way most town streets became after the second year. Not ruined exactly, just thinned. A dry maple leaf scraped once along the curb. Somewhere, a loose gutter tapped in the wind. Farther down the block, a delivery truck from our quarry settlement stood parked under a sycamore with its rear doors open, waiting for me to tell the crew whether this row of offices was worth their time. I looked up at the second-floor windows. Half the blinds were open, half were closed. That, more than the aquarium, made me suspicious. Blinds tell you how a building was left. They tell you whether somebody fled in a hurry, whether a cleaner finished a shift, whether a room became a bedroom for a week and then stopped, whether the sun mattered to someone after the grid went uncertain. Uniform blinds mean management. Uneven blinds mean people. And people, even absent people, leave questions behind them. I circled the building once before I tried a door. That was also rule 1. If you work as a scout long enough, you start to feel the shape of a building before you cross its threshold. The back alley was clean. Too clean for a row of empty medical offices. No blown papers. No split trash bags. No rat sign around the bins. The downspouts had not overflowed recently, which meant the roof drains were probably still clear. There was one second entrance through a staff corridor, metal framed and painted the same resigned beige every dentist's back entrance seems to prefer. No pry marks. No recent shoe scuffs. At the rear, I found the service panel open. Not forced open. Unlatched and swinging slightly in the morning wind. Inside, 2 breakers had been flipped down, one for the sterilization room, one for the X-ray suite. The aquarium line, absurdly, was still live. That told me 2 things at once. First, someone competent had been in the building after the collapse, long enough to reduce load intentionally. Second, whoever they were, they had not stayed. I made a mark on my pad. Power partial. Water unknown. No visible exterior breach. Possible controlled abandonment. Then I stood very still and listened again. No footsteps overhead. No plumbing drip. No flies. Just the pump in the aquarium and, very faintly, a clock, ticking somewhere deeper inside. That was when I turned and waved to the truck crew. "Give me 10 minutes," I called. They nodded and settled back against the bumper in the patient, resigned way people do when they work with scouts. You learn not to hurry the person deciding whether a building still belongs to gravity, weather, or memory. My name is Elias Mercer. Most people called me Eli before the collapse, and still do. Though in the settlement ledgers, I am listed as Field Scout 3, Structural and Access Assessment, because once communities get serious, they start naming jobs in ways that make them harder to romanticize. I am 41 years old, and before everything changed, I worked as a county building inspector. That sounds more glamorous than it was. Mostly I checked exits, fire doors, occupancy loads, stair rails, sprinkler clearances, smoke dampers, and all the minor quiet things that keep ordinary buildings from becoming traps. Strip malls, schools, tire shops, clinics, apartment renovations, church kitchens, storage additions, offices, feed stores, dental suites like the one in front of me. If a contractor changed a wall or opened a business, I or someone like me walked through with a clipboard and tried to imagine how people would behave there on their least thoughtful day. That was the real job, though the paperwork pretended otherwise. Building codes are not just measurements. They are predictions about panic, laziness, smoke, haste, weather, and the average citizen's ability to misunderstand a door under pressure. I was good at it because I was patient, and because I had a habit of asking simple, unfashionable questions. Can people get out? Can water get in? What happens if the lights fail? What happens if someone panics in the wrong part of the room? I did not know it then, but those were already scout questions. After the collapse, when our settlement at High Shelf Quarry began sending teams into the surrounding towns for supply assessment, route mapping, and later search and recovery, I turned out to be useful in a way that felt uncomfortably continuous. Everyone else saw abandoned buildings. I saw roofs, thresholds, load paths, stale air, trapped heat, dead plumbing, panic routes, and what was likely still sound enough to trust for 15 minutes. So I became a scout. Not a heroic one. That is important. If you hear the word scout and picture a man slipping alone through heroic ruin with a rifle across his back and noble purpose in his jaw, you've been misled by too many posters and not enough municipal paperwork. Real scouting, at least where I come from, is slower and more procedural. You look, you listen, you mark, you retreat, you report. You do not enter every building. You do not clear every room. You do not treat silence as permission. Mostly, you decide whether a space is safe enough to justify another person's time. The work grew out of 6 rules. They were not inherited from a dead ranger station, or found in a notebook, or painted on a barn beam by someone who knew the future. We made them at a folding table in the quarry workshop during the first autumn, after 2 bad entries, 1 broken ankle, and a near-fatal mistake involving an interior stairwell and a locked records office. By then, we had learned enough to stop pretending common sense would organize itself under fatigue. The rules are these. Rule 1. Circle before you enter. Rule 2. Find 2 exits before 1 room. Rule 3. Let the stairs tell you the truth. Rule 4. If the air feels wrong, leave. Rule 5. First trip is for information, not carrying. Rule 6. Closed interior doors belong to daylight and company. I have repeated them so often that I no longer think of them as sentences. They're more like joints in the hand. Movement that became instruction by surviving use. On the morning with the aquarium, I followed them as I always did. Circle before you enter. Done. Find 2 exits before 1 room. Front door. Rear service door. Side emergency egress. Through common hall, if unblocked. Let the stairs tell you the truth. I had not yet reached the stairs, but I already knew I would if I went in, because second-floor office buildings lie through their carpets and reception plans, while their stairs tell the truth about movement, load, and recent use. If the air feels wrong, leave. That remained to be tested. First trip is for information, not carrying. So even if the medicine cabinets were full, and the sterilization trays gleamed, and the supply closet held nitrile gloves enough to make our clinic smile for a week, I would not touch them yet. Closed interior doors belonged to Daylight and Company, which meant if anything inside that office suite was locked beyond what I could reasonably see around, I would mark it and come back with another scout. That is how we stay alive. Not by being braver than buildings, but by being slower. I took the rear door first. The corridor smelled like old carpet glue, mint cleaner, and dry dust. Not rot, not gas, not sewage. Good signs, though no scout worth keeping mistakes good signs for promises. My flashlight stayed low, and I let the daylight from the back door carry as far as it could. The break room was first on the right, empty, sink dry, coffee filters still stacked in a neat fan beside a machine someone had unplugged. On the corkboard hung a printed birthday list for the staff, all months and names, and one small cartoon tooth wearing sunglasses. Ahead, the hallway split toward treatment rooms and an interior stair. I stopped there. The stairwell was where the building told the truth. Rule 3 is the one outsiders understand least. They think it means stairs are dangerous, which of course they are. But it means more than that. Stairs tell you who has been moving vertically, whether they were carrying weight, whether the building's envelope has stayed dry, whether handrails still matter, whether someone has slept there, whether a second floor is using the first floor as a lie. This stairwell was clean. No grit slides on the treads, no bird droppings through the upper vent, no recent shoe abrasion in the dust except for one set of small, careful prints going up and none coming down. I crouched and studied them. Rubber soles, probably soft work shoes, not boots. Adult-sized but narrow. 2 weeks old perhaps. Dry enough at the edges to hold shape. Then I looked at the handrail. Wiped. Not polished. Not dusty. Simply wiped once, a while ago. I stepped back, without going farther. The building was not empty in the simple way we had assumed. It had been left in stages, possibly used after, possibly abandoned by degrees. That made it valuable, but it also meant I would not be the one to solve it alone. I backed out, closed the rear door behind me, and marked the jam with our chalk code. Blue triangle, structurally sound on first pass. 1 horizontal slash, limited live utilities. Circle with open center, possible human use after collapse. 2 F prints, and the date. Then I went back to the truck. Worth a second team, I told them. Not today. No salvage yet. One of the younger crewmen, Jory, looked disappointed. He had come of age after the first winter, and still carried a beginner's optimism about what empty buildings should provide. Nothing in there. Probably plenty in there, I said. That's not the same thing. He nodded, because we had been working on that distinction for months. We turned the truck toward High Shelf by 11:30, and the dentist's office remained behind us with its lit aquarium and its careful, stale silence. I thought about it most of the drive home, though the road demanded enough attention that thought arrived in intervals. High Shelf Quarry sits in a limestone cut about 12 miles north of town, where a private aggregate company used to blast, crush, wash, and ship roadstone before the collapse made asphalt feel like a promise from another species of society. From the county highway, you see only berms, a scale house, and the top half of the old conveyor tower. The rest of it lies folded into the land. That is one reason it survived. The quarry had always been a practical place, not pretty from above, though there is beauty in worked land if you spend enough time with it. The main pit descends in broad stepped benches around a lake of groundwater and runoff the company once used for wash water. The upper yard holds the machine shop, parts warehouse, office trailers, fuel tanks, tire shed, electrical room, and scale platform. South of that stand the crushing plant, conveyor frames, the maintenance bay, and 3 long aggregate storage bins roofed in corrugated steel. At the highest edge of the property, there is a drilled well, a concrete settling tank, and an emergency fire pond fed by rain and diverted runoff from the berms. When the county started to fray, the quarry offered several advantages at once. One road in, wide sight lines, durable buildings, heavy equipment, diesel tanks, workshops, enough open space for gardens and livestock if someone had the nerve to imagine them there. And, most important to my mind, water that could be pumped, filtered, settled, and rationed without depending on the city. I came there on the 4th day of the collapse with one pickup truck, my tool chest, 3 clean changes of clothes, the county's spare set of building plans for the school complex, and more uncertainty than I had admitted even to myself. My decision had not felt dramatic. That is worth stating because people like to impose drama on turning points. In truth, I realized the county roads were going to fail before the town offices admitted it, because I spent my days thinking about capacity and circulation. The urgent care parking lots filled before noon. School vestibules clogged with parents trying to remove children from buildings whose dismissal plans had not yet caught up. Hospital ambulance bays backed into streets designed for ordinary traffic. Grocery receiving docks jammed because forklifts require staffing, and staffing was already being eaten by fever, rumor, and desperate phone calls. By the 3rd day, I understood that buildings were no longer serving their intended flows. Once that happens across multiple civic types at once, the road system follows. My older cousin Mara, who had been a paramedic before she burned out on city administration and took contract medical work at the quarry, sent one text. "If you're coming, come before dark, and bring tools, not keepsakes." That was enough. When I arrived, High Shelf still looked like a workplace pausing before a difficult weather event. People at folding tables, fuel accounting, makeshift cots in the parts warehouse, the old lunchroom stocked with canned soup and contractor coffee. A loader parked across the access road more from instinct than policy. No speeches, just an atmosphere of adults already making lists. Mara met me at the machine bay with blood on one sleeve and no apology for it. "Not mine," she said, seeing where I looked. "You hungry?" "Not especially." "Good. You can help with the south washroom line then." That was how I joined. Not through ideology, through work. High Shelf. In those first weeks was run by a handful of people whose skills mattered too obviously to be debated. Mara handled medical and intake because she knew fever from dehydration, panic from shock, and when a bitten person was still reachable by plain language. Anton Vale, no relation, had been quarry foreman for 15 years and understood diesel, loaders, pump lines, welding crews, and the temper of every machine on site. Tess Herrera, who had managed procurement and payroll before numbers became a different kind of morality, took inventory, rationing, and later exchange with other settlements. Renzo Cruz, usually called Ren, was a welder and field mechanic who could make doors, carts, shelving, and irrigation manifolds out of the sort of leftover steel most people would walk past without gratitude. Grace Lee, an agricultural extension agent stranded here while evaluating soil runoff remediation, transformed one of the covered aggregate bins into a greenhouse before anyone else had even decided they were staying through the season. And me, because I knew buildings, thresholds, and the difference between empty space and safe space, became the first scout, almost by default. The quarry settled into its own structure because quarries already think in zones. Upper yard for intake, vehicle check, and fuel. Workshop for repair and assembly. Scale house for records and watch. Former office trailers for administration, school, and sleeping quarters for the elders who preferred smaller doors. Machine bay for kitchen during the first month, Then later the kitchen moved to the old compressor shed once we understood the wind better. The parts warehouse became our communal hall because it was long, insulated, relatively dust-tight, and easy to heat in winter once Wren built two monstrous but effective stoves from brake drums and scrap plate. The quarry lake itself was not drinking water, but it became utility water after treatment for washing, laundry, gardens, and cooling certain systems. Potable water came from the well on the upper bench, passed through sand, carbon, UV, and one beautiful improvised polishing system I am still slightly vain about. Below the West Berm, the abandoned explosives magazine became root cellar, then archive, then root cellar again once we admitted paper mattered less than potatoes in January. That was high shelf. Not a bunker. Not a fortress. A work site that became a settlement by being honest about what it could do. Our daily routine reflected that honesty. At dawn, pump crew and water check. I usually took first numbers because old habits love early light. At 7, breakfast in the warehouse. Porridge. Bread if we had it. Canned fruit if trade had been kind. At 8, assignments on the board. Quarry maintenance, kitchen, clinic, gardens, livestock if we had any at that stage, external runs, salvage processing, schooling, sanitation. Scouts left either at full dawn or not at all. That rule came before the 6 building rules because it was too obvious to argue with. Daylight is equipment. In the beginning, our scout work was broad and dull in the best sense. Map roads, check bridges, identify intact warehouses, note fuel yards, clinics, veterinary offices, hardware stores, feed sheds, machine depots, and civic buildings that could later support exchange with other survivors. Do not carry back half the county just because you miss abundance. Bring back what improves the quarry's chances of making it to the next week. That sounds disciplined now. It was learned painfully. The first bad entry happened in a home improvement store 2 towns over. A young man named Eric, who had done roofing before the collapse and still moved through abandoned commercial spaces as if consumer order were a permanent law of nature, went through a fire door into the upper stock mezzanine alone because he saw boxed water filters on a shelf. He missed the fact that the mezzanine decking had warped under a roof leak and that a second exit ladder on the far side had been removed years earlier. He fell only 1 level, which is how he kept the leg, and lost the habit of arguing with scouts. But carrying him out cost us 6 people's energy, a handcart, and the rest of that day. The second bad entry was worse. It happened in a shuttered bank branch with a records room at the back. The front lobby was intact. The office doors hung open. The air was clean. It looked ordinary, in the misleading way financially unsuccessful buildings often do. I was not on that team. Mara was, along with Tess and a former sheriff's deputy named Paul. They found one locked interior records room and decided to leave it for later. Paul went back anyway, alone, because he thought the locked room might hold document boxes useful for identity reconstruction, or, failing that, good shelving. There was a fevered man inside who had barricaded himself weeks earlier and survived longer than seemed plausible on bottled water, stress, and whatever had been left in the manager's cabinet. When the door came open, instinct did the rest. Paul survived because Mara is very good and because his gloves were on. But the story was enough. After that, we held the workshop meeting and wrote the 6 rules. Not for drama, for repetition. Repetition is what turns good judgment into communal safety. By the time I found the dentist's office aquarium, the rules had been working for nearly 18 months. They changed how we entered the world. Rule 1. Circle before you enter. That means more than a perimeter lap. It means the building begins outside the threshold. Look at the gutters. Look at the vents. Look at the glass. Listen at the rear wall. Watch birds, insects, plant growth, power lines, downspouts, and how the trash has accumulated. A building's envelope tells you what the interior has been enduring. Rule 2. Find 2 exits before 1 room. No scout enters a structure without knowing at least 2 ways back out. Not because we expect cinematic pursuit, because collapsed shelving, soft floors, bad locks, weather, wasps, raccoons, and simple bad luck all exist. Doors matter. Windows matter. Fire stairs matter. A scout without retreat options is not brave. He is dead. Rule 3. Let the stairs tell you the truth. I have already said why. Stairs reveal traffic, moisture, and dishonesty. They are the first place panic leaves a readable shape. Rule 4. If the air feels wrong, leave. Smell is part of it. Rot, sewage, gas, dead refrigeration, wet drywall, rodent saturation, chemical bite. But air means more. Heat trapped where it should not be. Dust motes hanging too thick. Humidity on a dry day. A building can feel wrong through the lungs before the mind names it. Rule 5. First trip is for information, not carrying. Looting disguises itself as efficiency. It tells you to grab what you can while you are there. That is how you miss the second stairwell, the wet ceiling, the locked back room, the dog sleeping under the copy desk, or the air quality change beyond the hall. First trips are for maps, notes, counts, and the decision whether a second team belongs there at all. Rule 6. Closed interior doors belong to daylight and company. This is the hardest one for certain personalities. A closed door is a wager. It may conceal medicine, batteries, blankets, tools, or records. It may also conceal a person, an animal, a collapsed ceiling, bad air, trapped heat, or the exact wrong surprise at the exact wrong distance. Scouts do not solve those wagers alone. Those rules shaped not only my work, but my sense of what empty meant. Because buildings after the collapse were rarely empty in the way people first imagine. They were emptied, paused, half-abandoned, partially used, revisited, or left in layers. Some had been stripped so cleanly they seemed like diagrams. Others still held the last warm shape of lives that had only just stepped out. A school office with attendance sheets laid out by date. A feed store whose ledger stopped mid-column. An apartment with clean dishes drying on a rack and every bedroom drawer open. A church kitchen with soup pots, scrubbed and stacked, as if someone had ended an emergency on purpose and never returned to explain it. A suburban garage containing 3 bicycles, a freezer, 2 trunks of Christmas lights, and a man's suit hanging in clear plastic from the ceiling beam, because that was the safest dry place his wife could think of when the basement flooded 2 years earlier. Scouting, if you do it long enough, teaches you that buildings are really time-arranged for other people. That is why the work can be tender without becoming sentimental. My job was never just to bring things back. It was to decide what kind of conversation the settlement would have with the abandoned world. Extractive, hurried, clumsy, or measured, annotated, restrained enough that if someone ever walked back into their own old life, they could tell it had been entered by people with rules rather than desperation. Tess formalized that instinct before I could name it. She created the return shelf in the warehouse by the second winter. It began as one section of metal racking labeled with painter's tape and thick black marker. Identifiable/personal/do not issue. Medicine with names we might trace. Family photographs, school records, hand-labeled recipe tins, locks of hair in envelopes, religious items, wedding clothes, password notebooks, though those were a moral swamp and we kept them sealed. Prescription glasses, a child's hearing aid charger, dog collars with tags, cremation boxes. At first, some people thought this was too delicate for our situation. Tess only said, "If we stop distinguishing between useful and ours, we will get uglier than scarcity requires." So the shelf stayed. That decision, more than any speech, defined High Shelf for me. We were not merely a scavenger camp with a water system. We were trying to become a place that could look another future in the face without embarrassment. That moral line mattered to me most on the day I scouted my old apartment building. It happened in late November of the second year. The quarry needed boiler controls from a commercial supplier on the far side of town, and the cleanest route passed within 2 blocks of the apartment complex I had lived in before the collapse. I had not gone back on purpose. There had always been more urgent buildings, more communal reasons, more distance between who I had been there and who I needed to be at High Shelf. But routes narrow over time, and the city had become smaller in its utility than in its memory. The complex was a 3-story brick walk-up with external breezeways, built in the 80s, improved badly in the 90s, and managed by a company that loved beige paint and hated drainage. I knew every creak in the stair, every bad seal around the laundry room door, every tenant who propped the south entrance with a rock while taking in groceries. It had once embarrassed me how well I knew those things. After the collapse, it simply meant I knew where the building would fail first. I stood in the lot that day with one younger scout named Mara, not my cousin Mara, but a 16-year-old who had apprenticed into the scouting crew and was beginning to understand why I cared about lintels, and looked up at my old balcony. The potted rosemary was long dead. The chair I had bought at a hardware clearance was still there, tipped against the wall. Nothing moved behind the blinds. "You don't have to go in," Mara said. "We do," I told her. "The supplier next door shares a wall and a utility easement. I need to know the fire door condition." That was true. It was also not the whole truth. We entered under the rules. Circle. 2 exits. Stairs first. Air. Information. Closed doors. The building was dry enough, which surprised me. A roof patch done 2 summers before the collapse had apparently held. Hallway air was stale, but not hostile. Mailboxes downstairs had been opened, some carefully, and some not. A child's scooter lay in the common stair. I recognized the blue hallway carpet and hated it for surviving better than some people had. My unit was unlocked. That in itself hurt less than I expected. Locks are contracts with ordinary time. Inside, everything was smaller. That happens when you leave a life and then return as logistics. The bookshelves were there, the cheap sofa, the skillet hanging above the stove because the cabinets had always been too shallow. On the fridge door, a magnet from a county fair I did not even remember attending. Someone had taken the canned food and all but one blanket. They had left the lamp because the cord was frayed. They had left my box of winter reports because paperwork weighs more than hunger justifies. They had left the ceramic bowl. I stood in the kitchen for perhaps 20 seconds and understood very clearly how easy it would be to turn Rule 5 into a lie for personal reasons. First trip is for information, not carrying. The bowl was small. The box of books by the sofa was manageable. My father's compass, still in the junk drawer, took no space at all. Mara, bless her, said nothing. Instead, she studied the fire door to the supply building through the utility passage and reported calmly on the rust around the panic bar. That gave me somewhere to put my mind. We marked the shared wall, logged the controls in the neighboring supplier building, checked the roof ladder access, and left. I carried nothing. On the truck ride home, I regretted that with a force that made me feel childish and extremely alive. Then, 2 weeks later, a family arrived from the lower district with one of the boys carrying that same county fair magnet tied to a string around his neck because he said he liked how cold the metal felt. His mother had been living 2 floors above me during the first month and recognized my name on the old tenant notices when Tess logged them. She had taken some food from my apartment after the water failed in the complex. She apologized, though I had not asked for it. I told her she did right. Later, when roots were calmer, she brought me the compass from the junk drawer in a folded dish towel. That was when I understood the return shelf had already changed the world more than I had known. Our system evolution after the second winter made the quarry feel less temporary in useful ways. Grace's greenhouse expanded from 1 converted aggregate bay to 2, with drip lines fed by treated utility water and heat scavenged from the generator shed through an absurd but effective ducting plan. Ren spent 3 weeks defending against everyone's skepticism. We started lettuces, onions, winter greens, and eventually tomatoes again, though never enough to avoid reverence. The livestock yard gained rabbits, then chickens, then 2 practical goats who disliked me personally, but improved morale by being impossible to mythologize. Water improved too. That pleased me most. We added roof catchment off the warehouse and machine bay, increased settling capacity, and built a sand charcoal polishing train for gray utility runoff that let us reserve the well more intelligently through dry months. I wrote maintenance boards for every major line. Mara apprenticed under me and began catching small pump noises before I did. The younger scouts learned how to shut valves, read roof sag, spot sewer gas, and tell the difference between dust and dangerous air at a stair landing. Scouting itself became less about random salvage and more about regional maintenance. We mapped which buildings were worth preserving, even if we could not use them yet. Clinic, school, machine shop, grain co-op, library basement, 1 church with a sound roof, a tire depot, 2 veterinary offices, 3 warehouses, and a municipal records annex that Tess cared about more than I did, until I realized birth records, maps, and land plats are also a kind of food for the future. We tagged them according to a simple code. Sound, limited use, water risk, heat risk, possible occupants, personal effect significant, do not strip. We also began leaving notes in some places. Not dramatic notes, just date, scout mark, what had been taken, and where people could inquire if they were alive and looking. It felt decent. By the 3rd spring, nearby settlements had learned our symbols well enough that a chalk triangle on a warehouse jam could save them a wasted day or a bad roof. That may be the most satisfying professional accomplishment I will ever claim, making building assessment legible enough that tired strangers used it correctly. There was one mission, though, that changed how I felt about Rule 6 more than any other. It was in the old municipal archive building near the courthouse square, 3 stories of brick and poured concrete with a basement records vault and 1 narrow stair tower on the north side. We went in for plat books, tax maps, and school maintenance records, which sounds dull until you understand that half the region's rebuilding depended on knowing where lines, deeds, wells, and easements actually lay. The building had already been circled. 2 exits found. Stairs checked. Air acceptable. 1st floor clear. 2nd floor old offices stripped neatly. 3rd floor too hot under the roof, nothing urgent. The only remaining question was the basement vault corridor. 1 interior steel door there stood closed. Not jammed. Closed. The temptation was obvious. Records. Probably dry. Probably useful. I almost opened myself. Then I looked at the watch. 2 hours to sunset. Basement. Interior locked steel door. Narrow corridor. No second scout with me besides Mara. who was capable but still green enough that I tried not to let my curiosity draft her into my mistakes. Closed interior doors belong to daylight and company. So I marked the door, and we left. The next morning we returned with 4 people, portable lanterns, a pry bar, a door wedge kit, and the kind of patient focus that always makes me trust crews more. Inside that room, we found no infected, no cinematic shock, and nothing that would have rewarded solo heroics. What we found was a former clerk named Mrs. Calder, 70 if she was a day younger, very much alive, camped among plat books and stale crackers because the building's basement had stayed cool and the vault door made her feel safe. She had survived by making herself small, drinking from the sink until the water died, then breaking into staff bottled water reserves and waiting for a sound she trusted enough to answer. She told us later that the first 2 times people came through the building, they moved too fast and spoke too loudly. She had stayed silent. The 3rd time, hearing us pause at the closed door and then leave. She decided anyone who left a door unopened, rather than forcing it in failing light, might be worth waiting for. That is the sort of compliment that settles into a person's bones. We brought her back to High Shelf with the plat books, and she spent the next year reorganizing half our records room, correcting Tessa's handwriting where warranted, and teaching children the difference between a field boundary and a property myth. That is what rules are for, in the end. Not obedience for its own sake. The slow accumulation of survivable trust. By then, High Shelf no longer felt like a camp that happened to be persisting. It felt like a working place in its own right. Morning smoke from the kitchen chimneys. Pump logs clipped to the utility board. Children running lessons in the old office trailer schoolroom. Trade carts under tarps. Weld spatter at dusk from Wren's bench. Laundry lines over the south berm. The warehouse door rolling open each evening to release the day's heat and the smell of lentils, soap, metal, and wet stone. Our scout board took up one whole wall near the main entrance. Maps, building tags, route notes, bridge status, clinic requests, seasonal hazards, and what Tess called the human layer. Names tied to places that might still matter. A son looking for his mother's glasses, a teacher's certificate, 1 wedding ring, 2 family photo tins, veterinary records for a breeding pair of sheep. I think that human layer kept us from becoming too efficient for our own moral good. People sometimes ask whether scouting empty buildings made me lonely. The honest answer is that it made me precise about loneliness. There is a difference between loneliness and vacancy. A vacant room is just unoccupied volume. Loneliness is a pattern built for company, continuing after company has gone. A mug left by a sink. Shoes lined under a bed. A chore chart on a fridge. 3 extension cords braided behind a television stand because one man disliked looking at slack kabodible. Buildings are full of those traces. Exactly. It is to understand that human order is always more tender and improvisational than we admit when life feels secure. That understanding made our own routines at High Shelf feel less like drudgery and more like proof. Sweep the pump room. Close the grain bins. Post the water numbers. Sharpen the greenhouse shears. Rotate canned beans. Teach the younger scouts to read a cracked lintel and a wet stair. Clean the truck mirrors before dawn. None of it glamorous. All of it the opposite of vacancy. In the 4th year, when the towns below had begun to differentiate into the places that would endure and the places that would mostly return to field, I took Jory, the same young crewman who had once been disappointed by the dentist's office, out on his first lead scout assignment. We went back there together. The aquarium had stopped months before, of course. Dust filmed the glass. The fish were gone, likely long before I first saw them, which is a sad truth I had not wanted to examine closely at the time. The upper floor footprints had been traced to a hygienist who had camped there for 6 days before moving to her parents' farm. She had shut down the sterilization circuits to preserve the remaining battery on the building and left the aquarium running because she said, when we met her later, I couldn't leave the room completely dead. That made sense to me. We entered on a bright morning under all 6 rules and carried nothing back but supply notes, a few sealed dental kits, and the names of 3 staff whose licenses might still matter at the clinic settlement west of us. Jory noticed the handrail wipe marks before I did. That is how you know training has begun to become culture. Now, years on, I still scout. Less often than in the first years, because we have more trained people, and because some buildings have settled fully into either usefulness or collapse. But I still take the first pass on anything structurally uncertain, historically meaningful, or morally complicated. Schools, clinics, municipal buildings, old apartment blocks where whole floors may still hold a future's paperwork, houses only when invited by necessity, and never for curiosity. High Shelf remains my home. The quarry benches are greener now where Grace bullied soil into existence. The warehouse has better insulation. The kitchen moved again, this time for good, into the old field office because the light is kinder there. The goats remain unhelpful. Mara is no longer my apprentice, but the actual water chief, which she enjoys pretending not to deserve. Tess still keeps the return shelf, though it has expanded into a proper room with indexed crates and ledgers. Mrs. Calder still corrects everyone's maps and calls me young man when she wants me to feel both useful and badly supervised. At dawn, if the weather is clear, you can stand on the upper berm and see half the county. The quarry below. The road bending south into town. The school roof catching sun. The grain silos in the far flats. The line of sycamores near the river road. And beyond that, the suggestion of neighborhoods where some buildings are now homes again. Some are storehouses. Some are clinics. Some are simply left closed because not everything abandoned needs to be re-entered to have meaning. That may be the last thing scouting taught me. A door is not an argument you must win. Some buildings are for salvage. Some are for shelter. Some are for memory. Some are for later. And some are best left with their own silence because other people have already given enough of themselves to the threshold. If you came to High Shelf now and found our scout board, the 6 rules would be written at the top in Tess's hard, clear hand. People new to the work usually read them once and think they are about danger. They are partly. But after a few months, they understand they are really about time. Circle before you enter, because buildings speak before doors do. Find 2 exits before 1 room, because retreat is part of honest entry. Let the stairs tell you the truth, because surfaces flatter and structures confess. If the air feels wrong, leave, because your lungs know before your pride does. First trip is for information, not carrying, because greed is bad mapping. Closed interior doors belong to daylight and company, because curiosity is cheap and consequences are not. That is the whole craft. No prophecy. No mythology. No drama except what people drag in with them. Just a changed world. A county full of paused rooms and a settlement in a quarry trying to meet the future without becoming careless in the ruins of the old one. Some mornings I still think about the aquarium. The way it glowed in that waiting room like a tiny machine insisting on routine after routine had already failed. The way it almost made me mistake motion for safety. The way circling the building told the truth, the front window could not. That feels like most of the work, really. Not charging through the first story a building offers. Walking around it. Listening longer. Admitting what it has become before you ask what it can still give. If that sounds slower than survival is supposed to be, I can only say that slowness has kept me alive more reliably than urgency ever did. And in the evening, when the trucks return to high shelf, and the chalk marks of the day are transferred to the board, and the warehouse doors roll open to let out the heat, and someone in the kitchen is cursing softly at onions, while children run the last light out of themselves along the gravel, I look at the map wall, and the route notes, and the careful list of closed doors waiting for daylight and company. Then I go wash up for supper, because that too is part of the system. And systems, if they are worth anything, should make room for people to come home from the empty places.